Welcome to the Dark Mind Podcast. Friends and familiars, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Dark Mind Podcast, where we explore the boundless realm of dark literature and film. On today's show, I have an author who has created a space opera where identity is fluid and fate is a battleground. He's joining me today to discuss his debut novel entitled Shadow of the Eternal Watcher. So without further ado, join me as we delve into the dark insight of Josh Mendoza. All right, friends and familiars, we are live on YouTube, Twitch, Trovo, and Facebook with Josh Mendoza here to discuss his debut novel, Shadow of the Eternal Watcher. Josh, welcome to the show.
Hey, Vince, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining me on this 24th day of February 2025. I came across your book via Bookstagram and was really interested in seeing your progression from directing a post-apocalyptic film to writing a space opera novel. The plot blends elements of noir, dystopia, sci-fi, drama, thriller, and good old-fashioned horror into a truly unique thrill ride. So thank you for the art you create, and thank you for joining me on the show today.
Well, like I said, thanks for having me, and I'm glad the book spoke to you, and I'm excited to get on and get into the nitty-gritty with you. It's been a labor of love, as most things are. So let's get the ball rolling, shall we?
Hell yeah. Well, so just to give kind of a brief overview, the book is about a man named Duster Rains, a combat veteran living with the trauma of war. He begins experiencing what initially seemed, at least to me, like hallucinations. The story opens with a striking scene from a fantastical world that appears to have a connection to where we first meet Duster. In classical noir fashion, he works as a PI and is approached by a mysterious woman who hires him to take on a missing persons case. And that is where the story begins. So the classic noir PI trope begins when Duster Rains, or Rains as he's known, meets the mysterious woman named Madison Andrews at a local bar about a job. She's beautiful, mysterious, and wants him to take on a missing persons case that happens to be her husband. So this is more out of curiosity on my part as to what point does the sci-fi aspect start creeping into what initially seems like the traditional detective story? Because in my head, and I'm not going to say it because I don't want to induce a spoiler, but in my head, I think I know, but I don't know, maybe I missed it.
Yeah, I mean, I always do genre mashups. So, I mean, you always kind of run the risk, right, of losing a certain type of audience because it's like, oh, I signed up for a detective noir book, or I signed up for a sci-fi. So I definitely wanted to make sure I sprinkled the breadcrumbs throughout. So, I mean, that fantastical prologue is definitely the setup, that science fiction element of the story. And then even in the first chapter, when she's talking to him, he thinks she's out of her mind, but she starts talking about aliens. She's talking about abductions. So as we go through each chapter, there's just a little breadcrumb of, hey, this is a sci-fi book as well. And to me, it really, I don't want to give too much away, but when he's almost apprehended by the FBI and they use a robotic animal to try to capture him, and he realizes that this is well beyond anything he's ever seen in his military service or in his time in the LAPD, and then obviously working the streets as a detective, he starts to suspect that something's going on, but he's still, you know, what's fun about a first person book is he has no idea that he's in this bigger world, right? He's down on his luck. He's burned out. He's like an ambulance chaser of a detective, right? So he doesn't know. So we get to kind of learn with him. So it's definitely a progression throughout the whole novel.
I just had like a flashback of a commercial for the local Houston ambulance chaser, Jim Adler, the tough, smart lawyer. Well, so it seems like, did you intend to, with those breadcrumbs you spoke about, kind of lead the audience on a bit as to, well, maybe these breadcrumbs equal mental illness?
Exactly, Vince. I mean, that was my thought. I mean, when you start, you're like, I had this idea for this big space opera. I had this idea for this kind of gritty, character driven noir mystery. And I'm like, well, how do I mash those together? So that was kind of the fun for me in writing it is getting there. And to me, is he a reliable narrator is an interesting idea, right? And right from the beginning, like you spoke to it, you were like, yeah, he's hallucinating. And that was definitely intentional. And I think even towards the end of the book, there are moments where you're like, can I trust Duster Raines? Because he's definitely a flawed person. He's a hero from his war service. He's also a villain from his war service. And he's a hero and a villain in his detective work as well. And he's been known to cut corners and try to get people that he thinks are guilty in kind of that classic LA noir. I'm judge, jury, and advocate as well. So I think he's not necessarily a trustworthy narrator, but he is too. And I think that's interesting is, you know, the reader can glean for themselves what they think as they go through the book as well, which is what I was going for.
Yes, sir. Love the morally gray.
Exactly.
Well, so Raines has a very problematic relationship with his lawyer, whom he also at one point dated. So is she trying to help him, control him, or protect him from himself?
You know, I think a lot of us have been in those relationships, right, where they didn't work out. You can't stand the person, but you also still love them. And I think that's where she's at. Every time she's with him, he's charming, he's a good guy, but she knows that when she's with him, his demons start to rear their ugly heads and he drinks too much and he's got PTSD and he's not necessarily the perfect partner, I'll say, for her. But I definitely think she has his best intentions at heart, but he has a tendency to do things that are not necessarily within the, like we said, like within the realm of the law. And she's a servant of the law, right? So definitely sometimes I think maybe her medicine is not what he would have wanted prescribed, but I think she's trying to help him throughout the book as well.
And what kind of law did she practice
She
specifically?
she was a civil defender.
Okay,
She takes on a lot of the free cases, right, for the low income people, and kind of
that's
chases
right.
that whole thing, which is sort of her plug into Juan as well, who's one of the other main
That's
characters
right.
in the book.
Yeah. So based on that, based on her choice of law that she practices, as well as kind of this strange, unhealthy relationship she has with Rains, not to knock anybody that takes it upon themselves to try and do good in the world, but your character specifically, was she a little bit codependent, maybe?
You know, I think she's a strong female character. I mean, I like Carla. I think there could be a book about Carla, and I definitely think that she fell for the wrong guy, though. I mean, and I think we all have that history. I mean, she has some history with her own father, and she even says, you know, I'm like a walking stereotype. It doesn't mean I have to keep doing it, though. And just because you are,
Yeah.
you're also a walking stereotype, but you keep doing the same stuff, and I'm going to break this pattern, right?
Uh-huh.
That's ad lib. She doesn't actually say that verbatim, but she says some of that, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. Well, two of the antagonists are individuals Raines believes to be FBI agents. Their names are Torian and Jacobs, and they abduct and blackmail him into helping them. And they're described as sociopaths. And when I hear them in the book described by different people as being sociopaths, I don't know why, but it makes me kind of, I always like the darker characters in any book. But when I hear them described that way, it's kind of thrilling to me. I like to think about the fact that these guys are just cold, calculating,
Yeah.
have no feeling, have no empathy, and so on. So I feel like, at least on my part, there's a tendency to romanticize or almost fetishize sociopaths in dark stories. Would you agree that a lot of people do that? And if so, could you venture a guess as to why?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all like escapism, right? So to me, a lot of times too in stories, the villains have more interesting and maybe perhaps realistic motives, right? They're not perfect. Whereas a lot of times when we watch a movie or we read a story, the hero is, I'm doing good, I have to save the day, and it's like point A to point B, let's go. Whereas the villain, they're not just trying to destroy the world for funsies. They have a backstory, and usually it's a good reason they're trying to do something, and something terrible has happened. So I think we tend to relate to that as well. And then in terms of the people we don't relate to, who are maybe off their kilter and true believers and sociopathic, but I think that some of that escapism of getting out of our everyday humdrum, and perhaps we like that. And I think we have to be careful sometimes in real life, because I think we have a tendency to maybe celebrate some of those qualities in people that maybe we shouldn't, because we've watched a few too many movies too. Because it is supposed to be pretend, it is fun, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what was it was the Jeffrey Dahmer series that they had. A lot of people I saw online were like, you guys, everybody is just, I understand it's a good series, but people are like elevating Jeffrey Dahmer as if he was something to be,
Yeah.
idolized, or, I mean, the guy was a bad guy.
He was a bad guy, but I mean, what's interesting about him is he did a lot of what he did because he was so handsome and charming, right? And that was like his whole shtick. And I think there's something interesting in that. He sucked people in, and we get sucked in by people, right? People we shouldn't, people who are evil, people who are maybe not evil, but only about themselves. And we get pulled into that sometimes. And we perhaps think, well, they can't be all that bad because I'm not all that bad. And sometimes people are that bad.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess Ted Bundy would be another example that used his good looks.
Yeah, I may have
So,
conflated those two, but yeah, the same idea, right?
oh, well, no,
Because
I
he's
think,
handsome too, right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think they were all handsome.
Well, did you base the possibility of the government's role in the story on any real world influences or conspiracy theories? Because I'm not a conspiracy, tinfoil hat wearing type of guy, but I love conspiracy theories because I just find it really interesting because they all contain a kernel of truth, which is how they suck you in, but then they go out into left field. So I always like to see how those are constructed.
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, I'm a big history buff, right? So, I mean, this book pulls on kind of the idea of like, what if this Roman Chinese empire kind of became one powerful alternate reality empire, right? So, to me, I think in terms of real world, I mean, we don't need to look too far to think of authoritarian governments. I mean, it's very prevalent throughout the 20th century, obviously, and I think we see it in our everyday lives today too. So, I think you were speaking to it too. I mean, there is something about a charismatic strongman leader that draws people in, right? And I think in my book, this alternate reality doppelganger of Duster Raines, who's achieved something greater than himself, is something that drives the real Duster Raines not crazy, but bothers him, right? Because he always imagined he would be that guy, and he's not. So I think that's an interesting thing to explore in character as well. Because to me, it always gets back to character. You do the macro, you do the big world building, and it always has to get back down to the individual characters and like what's driving them through each beat and what each moment. They can't just be little pieces you're moving around for plot purposes. They have to have motivation, and they have to have a reason for doing what they're doing as well.
Gotcha. So we've alluded to it already. Raines is dealing with a traumatic event from fighting in the first Gulf War as, I believe it was a fighter pilot, right?
Yes, he's a fighter pilot. He's shot down. Well, not shot down. He has a mechanical failure and crashes and has to survive in the deserts of Iraq and Kuwait, basically.
And that's where he gets put in, I'm not going to reveal it, but he gets put in a very morally Actually, probably the most morally gray that you could possibly get situation. So, in noir stories, personal demons often bleed into the case they're working on. So, how does Rain's past influence the way that he handles the missing persons case in this
Yeah.
story?
Well, you spoke to hallucinations. I mean, it's not clear. There is some science fiction aspects, fantasy aspects of those hallucinations that I won't get into too much because I don't want to ruin the book. But he does these terrible things, and then those demons literally haunt him. They do follow him around. Now, whether or not that's in his head or that's real, that's for us to find out on the journey of this book. But I think that tormenting and that drive is why he does the things he does when he was in the LAPD and then as a detective. He's trying to right the wrongs of the past, right? And but also doing more wrong to try to right the wrong. So where do you draw the lines of what's the greater good, right? And I think that's that moral gray and ambiguity. And Duster Raines lives in that moral ambiguity. That's all he knows. So I definitely think that that past event is his main driving force through everything he does. That was the point that turned his life in the direction it went.
Well, as far as the situation himself, does he face external consequences for his actions, or is the punishment merely internal? And what I mean by that is, was anybody else aware that that happened, or was that just something that he was holding inside? Did he suffer any sort of consequences from the military?
No, so that's been his dark secret that he kept to himself. He managed to get away. He was extracted. A SEAL team pulled him out, and then he's just gone on living his life. So a lot of that has been his own punishments to himself. The only person he's actually told that to is Carla. We learned that in the book. But he can't accept that she would forgive him for it either. So he's definitely lost in his own head.
Hmm. That's interesting. So he did reveal it, but at the same time, once he did it, it kind of indelibly tainted their relationship
That's
because
right.
once he did that, he's like, well, there's no way she could,
Yeah,
we
either
can't.
she's a liar and she doesn't forgive me, or she's not a good person. So I'm going to prove that she does love me. And, he basically self sabotages.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Rains stops by his office and he finds a note from Madison Andrews, the mysterious woman, that has instructions to retrieve something from a safe deposit box that she had proactively opened in his name. And unlike traditional safe or hidden compartments, a safe deposit box exists in a liminal space, not quite public, not quite private. So, did that duality influence the way you wrote this moment?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of an interesting conundrum of how's he going to get it, right? And then through going through the process, he kind of realizes she set it up for him to be able to get it. And then when he does get it, it's sort of like, I don't even know what this is. It kind of keeps driving the mystery forward. So, I mean, it was sort of just the fun. I watch a lot of film noir and I've read a lot of film noir. So there's always these red herrings, what's real, what's not, and then just running around LA and trying to find you're in the desert, you're in the mountains, you're in the city, you're on the subway. You go touch every part of these cities in these stories. So it was just another fun way too to kind of get him driven back and then also kind of show more of that science fiction element too and maybe start to tease more of that as well.
Yeah, and I feel like there's something thrilling about he's going into this closed off area, but initially he's with somebody that he does not know at all and who has to turn a key and unlock whatever it is he's getting into right in front of him. So it's almost like they're right there on the verge of the discovery with him, but then by procedure or law they withdraw. It's kind of
Mm-hmm. And then it's just kind of a fun nod. I mean, there's opening the box. There's a glowing stone within it that seems to almost have a magical component to it. And that's a nod to certain stories in the past too. So for me, it's like sometimes those Easter eggs don't matter to the reader who doesn't know them, but they're kind of fun nods if you're a buff of the genre as well.
well, Rain, once he makes the discovery, He pays a visit to Madison's house and finds that he is then drawn deeper into a web of intrigue by being further blackmailed by the FBI agents. At least I think he was being blackmailed by them. So my question was the incident meant to apply more control, or was he just being turned into a patsy, which
Yeah,
I
I
think
mean,
is a bizarre word, but yeah,
yeah,
patsy.
he's sort of the patsy, he's sort of getting set up, and as we go through the story and realize there's more to these agents than meets the eye, we realize that they're kind of toying with him too. Like they want to see what he can do. They want to see if he's capable of overcoming some of these obstacles they put in his place, and they're just kind of having fun too,
Yeah.
in that sociopathic way. Like,
So was there the possibility that if he did successfully circumvent what they were attempting to perpetrate on him, that they would have utilized him further?
in my mind, I think they think he's not the same man as the alternate reality double that they know can probably run circles around him. So they are messing with them to see if there's anything there, but I think their intentions are malevolent and they don't intend to keep him around very long. And he maybe proves them, maybe not right, but he definitely proves them wrong in some ways too. And they're not the same person. And I think that's what's interesting too, is they have the potential to be the same person, but they're not the same person too.
Well, one thing I was really interested in is the fact that you do an amazing job of world building, especially in establishing a connection with an alternate reality. And so, when developing this connection, were you drawing from any mainstream theories of physics? Because I noticed at one point, I forget who it was, somebody mentioned the multiverse theory.
Yeah, I don't like to get too lost. I'm not Michael Crichton. I don't get too lost in the science. I love Michael Crichton, but
Yeah.
I definitely wanted it to be grounded in some type of science that's usable and realistic, but also then I took it and ran with it too. I'm not going to let reality get in the way of a good story either. So, and then just pulling on those classic science fiction tales, I was going back further. I mean, multiverses have kind of become ubiquitous, right? Marvel's gone kind of crazy with them, right? And
Okay.
I enjoy those movies too. But I mean, I was writing this before they kind of started going in that direction with those movies. The comic books have always kind of played with that. But I was kind of going back to Twilight Zone. I was back before my time to the original Star Trek with Mir Mir. And then I wanted to try to do something different with it though too. So rather than making everyone have a duplicate, I thought it would be fun if this world is so different you couldn't even recognize it if you put them next to each other. But there are a couple infinite reality, cosmic universe rolls of the dice that when that happens, you get some people that are the same. They may have different names, they have a different life, but they're the same cosmic connection between these two people. And when that happens, that's where some of the magic starts to happen in the story too. And that to me was an interesting. I didn't feel like I'd ever read that story, so that kind of excited me as thinking back to the kid who was sitting in the bookstore going through every Star Wars expanded universe book and all the classic sci-fi books, and what would he have wanted to pick up off the shelf. So that was something unique and different that I thought could be a fun thing for people to read.
If the universe expands to infinity,
Mm-hmm.
eventually these same circumstances and physical matter come together in the same way. Are we having the same conversation somewhere else?
In my world, in my universe, there is only evidence that humanity survives in these two universes, and there's a multiversal kind of war happening that
Yeah.
we kind of started, but we're losing. And that's a driving force behind this other reality trying to get into our reality is they want to connect with the other humanity and probably exploit us, probably use us, but also add some manpower to their cause and get some resources too, which is what most wars are about.
Yeah. Well, Rains gets to exercise a bit of his latent paternal instinct with Juan, a young boy who lives nearby. So, would you say Rains sees Juan as a surrogate son, or is it more of an instinctive need to protect someone vulnerable?
I think the latter. I think he never really wanted kids. He doesn't think he deserves children, but maybe there's a part of him that wishes he had. So maybe it's a little of both, right? So he definitely feels a connection to Juan. He doesn't really understand why, but he feels the need to try to help him. And, Juan does need his help, but also Juan sees right through him too. And Juan's a smart kid who he's seen a lot of the world, but he's also a very smart person in terms of his ability to use computers and do all these different things too. So he's intelligent and he's street smart. So he's kind of got both sides. And Reigns' act doesn't trick him either, but he sees the good person in Reigns too. And I think, like Carla, he wants him to be the man he could be versus the man he often is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think he had an inkling of how valuable Juan would eventually be.
I know, right? I thought that was fun, though.
Yeah, you're going to protect
Juan's
me.
Juan is like the closest probably to me,
Yeah.
in terms of like what he's talking about and what he's thinking, and that like natural inclination to engineering. He's a lot like my son too in that way. He was the kid who you'd come in and find him taking your toaster apart, right, and trying to figure out how it worked.
Yeah. Well, let's see here. Kind of in the same vein of what we were just talking about, but I guess to narrow it down a little bit more, noir detectives are often searching for something bigger than the case itself: redemption, justice, or truth. What is Duster Raines really searching for?
Yeah, I think we've touched on it a few times. I mean, I think redemption is what he thinks he's after through justice. He's like exacting justice, but I think really he wants to be forgiven and he wants to belong. He literally says that in the book. He wishes he could fit in. He doesn't feel like he ever can just be happy. And I think definitely there's some manic tendencies and some depressive tendencies that he exhibits. And I think his struggle is trying to find a place where he feels like he fits.
Mm-hmm. Well, the answer to this question for me would be no, but with regard to Raines and all of the skeletons he has in his closet and his complicated moral compass, is there a moment in the story where you, as the writer, doubted whether readers would keep rooting for him?
It's interesting because when you write, this is not the first version of this book I wrote, right?
Oh,
So
okay.
like there's a lot of edits. I think everyone knows that, but I'll just talk about it for a second. I mean, there's a lot of you let people read it, you have your beta readers, you let your friends read it. And they're like, "Oh, I love it, but I kind of got bored here, or I didn't understand what was happening here." And then as you try to fix those, and as you go through it, you get editors and you get your publisher, and they have notes too, and you are always kind of balancing what people say versus your own vision, right? And there was definitely some earlier versions of the story where I pushed because he to me was always not a good person, but he wanted to be one. So I definitely had some things that are no longer in this book where I think he maybe went too far, and you might have lost him. I might have lost some people, and I thought for me it was important that he not be a villain. He is the protagonist. He's not the antagonist, but he's both, right? So to me, I wanted him to be likable enough that you would keep reading and keep rooting for him too. So I think that was a balancing act because he does do some things that, like you said, are morally questionable and gray, and maybe there were some versions where he did things he went too far, and I pulled some of that back because that wasn't my intention. So it's always interesting too when you let other human beings read, or you talked about my movies, when you let them watch it, things you don't necessarily think are super important, they'll pick up on and they'll latch onto that, and you're like, oh, interesting. I didn't really, that was just a pass by moment, but like I need to probably fix that because they're going down some rabbit holes that I didn't intend. But also, I mean, once it's out there, I mean, it belongs to the reader, it belongs to the audience too, and they can interpret it however they want too. And so you only have so much control over that aspect of it, and then you just have to let it go be its own living entity with other people too, which is kind of it is the point, and it's kind of the fun of it.
Well, kind of piggybacking off the version of him that was revised, where you thought, it was possible that he went too far versus what ended up ultimately in the book, what collection or, I guess, combination of characteristics, and you don't have to get specific to produce spoilers, just in general characteristics, would you think would be present that would define him as an anti-hero?
Well, I think he's very selfish, right? He's very driven by I mean, we're talking about him like exacting justice. He wants to help people, but he wants to help people for himself. There is no helping people for other people. And maybe that's the journey he's on, to learn that lesson too, that it's not always just about him. And I think that Juan kind of pulls that out of him too, and gets back to the man he might have been if those terrible things hadn't happened to him. Like, he spiraled after some of the events that predate the book that sent his life on a course that he didn't intend. So, I think you spoke to it earlier too. We want to relate to him, right? We want to relate to people. We want to be able to understand. Yeah, I could see when, if I was in that situation, I don't think I would have done that, but I get what he was doing. Or I hate that he did that, but I can understand it. And that kind of makes you like him, hate him, connect with him. But if he goes too far and does something that, like, that's my red line of liking people, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting too what that is that's different for a lot of people too. So I mean, you're not going to please everyone too. So you can't like write to like an algorithm here and try to be like, okay, well, this is for this person, this is for this person, but you have to keep it in mind too, and you have to like write to your vision as well. And some people are writing stories where they want you to hate the person, and that's what they're going for, and that's interesting to them, and that's a version of a story too. But I definitely wanted to walk a fine line of teetering back and forth between if you're rooting for him or not. But I think he always pulls you back in.
Yeah. So the collection of characteristics would have to be leaning a little bit more into the previous incarnation for him to be considered an anti-hero here.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started writing it, I thought of him as an anti-hero, but I wanted him to be redeemed and maybe find the hero. So, I mean, there's definitely tropes from those types of stories that play throughout the book as well. And you definitely think of these things as a writer of like, how do I want this person to be perceived? And then as you write, the characters do tend to take on a life of their own, and they start to do things, and you sometimes go places you didn't expect when you really let your characters go where they're going to go and talk to people and say things that might surprise you as the writer, which sounds weird, but it happens where you kind of get into the zone. Sometimes you'll sit at the keyboard and you can't get any words out and you're just trying to get something to happen. And then sometimes I'll go into the zone, and I always say the muse speaks to you, and all of a sudden you're done and you're like, wow, I wrote like a couple thousand words, and maybe they say something that you didn't expect too. And that might take you to go back in the book too and say, okay, well, now that that's happening, I've kind of gone in a different direction. I have to fix this earlier part too, so that makes sense for a through line. So it's always sort of a game of, you have a plan, you start assembling, and then you go back and make it look like what you've ended up with was always planned at the beginning because you've changed it, right? So it's always kind of it's a dance of planning versus spontaneity.
Yeah. Well, most noir protagonists aren't the cleanest guys, but they
No.
usually have one or two lines they won't cross. What's Rain's line in the sand, and does he manage to keep from stepping over it? If it won't produce a spoiler.
Goodness. Reigns, he goes pretty far.
Yeah.
He's done some bad things. I think he's always willing to push the boundaries. And I think his code of honor kind of gets back to who he deems to be worthy and good. Like, so he would do anything to protect Carla. And I think Juan kind of gets into that mix as well. And I think as he grows through this book, he starts to see that he can do things selflessly for other people as well, and starts to kind of garner that code you're talking about. I think at the beginning of this book, he doesn't have much of a code anymore. He's near rock bottom. He actually falls further through the first part of the book, and I think he's finding his way back from it.
Well, amid the layers of personal demons, government conspiracies, and alternate realities, what is the one fundamental question you hope readers take away and wrestle with after finishing the book?
Yeah. So what was interesting to me was everyone doesn't have a double. Only certain people have doubles. The fact that we're following someone who has one. What makes you you? What makes us tick? And is it just circumstance that made him be the loser detective versus a very powerful person at the top of a hierarchy? Or is it nurture? Is it love? What is it? What makes us us? And I think that individuality, I think we're all very like driven by we're unique. What makes me me? I'm a person. And then we deal with our failures and our successes as they come. And I think seeing that it could have been a different way is really rankles Reigns in a way and kind of sets him on a course to try to claim a greater destiny. So I think for me, it's an interesting question slash conundrum when you have these science fiction alternate reality doubles of like, what makes me me anymore? And what am I really unique? Am I special? Or am I just like part of some bigger cosmic universe that I have no understanding of, and it doesn't really matter what I'm doing. So that was where I was going, and I think that there's more questions in the book than that, but that was kind of the main one that kind of piqued my interest when I first started writing it.
Beautiful. Well, I'm going to refrain from asking any more questions into the plot itself at the risk of inducing any spoilers. So I'll just say, great book. Listeners at home, buy it, read it, and review it. But as far as the origins of the story, was this story always planned as a novel, or did it start as something else, like a short story, screenplay?
Yeah, so we spoke to it. I mean, I'm a filmmaker first. I had a feature come out a few years back, What Still Remains. So when I started thinking of Shadow of the Eternal Watcher, my first go to was, okay, it's going to be a screenplay. But the more I thought about it, the more I was like, well, this is a huge blockbuster, big budget movie, right? And the more I thought about it, I'm like, well, maybe this is a cool little calling card I can send out to people, send to producers. And they're like, oh yeah, I love this guy. Now write me something different. Or they hire me, but it probably wasn't going to get made. So when I originally started studying writing, my first love was to be a novelist, and I pivoted to movies through just taking actually a film noir class that I kind of had
Oh,
a light
that sounds
bulb moment.
amazing.
It was
Film
an
noir
amazing class.
class.
We literally just went and watched film noir movies. I think we
Sounds
had to
amazing.
write a paper at the end, but I don't think it mattered. But it was great. It was a great class. But
Uh,
I grew up loving movies. My dad was a big cinephile. My mom was a big book lover, so I consumed story en masse when I was a kid. But I never really thought that I could make movies. So when I got in that class, I noticed a cut in the movie. It was the first time it was a really simple cut too. Like we're behind the guy, he spins around a pole, we're in front of him. It was from Citizen Kane. Very simple scene. No one would even notice it. But like in my mind, I was like, oh, well, someone put the camera there. It was the first time I'd ever really thought of that. And I thought, oh, well, I could do that too. So that kind of sent me on this course of film. But in thinking of this book, I was like, well, if it's going to be too big of a movie, maybe I should get back to that first love and write what I studied originally, which was novel writing and short story writing. So I kind of pivoted back to that first genre that I love and started chasing the book. And that's where this kind of became a book. So originally, it was probably a movie, but I think my screenwriting informed the movie too. Every chapter, I thought of how I write a scene in a movie. I was like, what's my in, what's my out, and what's driving the characters forward in this scene or this chapter? What's their purpose for being here? And if you can't answer all those questions, it probably shouldn't be in the story. So my intention was to write like an elevated page turner, is kind of how I kept thinking of it. I'm like, this is going to be a really well written, kind of a summer blockbuster page turner kind of vibe. And that's what I was going for.
yeah, when you mentioned what the budget would have to be, I started thinking about all the action and the fantastical elements. Like, yeah, that would be a lot of money.
Well, when you write a screenplay, I mean, sometimes you just write a screenplay and you're like, I don't care about budget. This is just like I said earlier, it's a calling card. You're not necessarily intending to make the movie. You hope you do, but you're pitching yourself as, look how talented I am, right? But when you're going to make a movie and you write the script, you start thinking, well, can I actually do this? Right. Like you might write the first draft and have the car chase, and then you sit down with your producers and it's like, well, we only have $1 million. So maybe instead of a car chase, you could run after him down an alley, right? You start changing the story to fit the reality of what you can actually accomplish, which sometimes can lead to more creative and cool ways of telling the story and makes the movies better. But when you write a book, you can write, they blow up the bridge and it blows up, right? Because
Hmm.
it's just in our imaginations. So that was fun and freeing in a way too, to just be able to write whatever I wanted and have the story serve itself versus trying to think ahead of what are the ramifications of me writing the bridge blows up, right?
Hmm. Just to make sure I heard you right, you said at first you wanted to be a novelist, but
Yeah.
then went to film school.
So when I was in high school, I went to Stanford University, and my dream was to be a novelist. I used to go to the bookstores. I'd like walk around and look where my name would be. I'd be like, oh, cool. If I wrote a fiction book, I'd be right next to Herman Melville and Moby Dick. There'd be Mendoza, right?
Uh,
And so I took a lot of short story classes. I studied under some great writers. I stayed under Adam Johnson, who wrote The Orphan Master's Son, and he hadn't written it then. So, I mean, that's cool to see him having grown and had success, but he taught me a lot. And so I took that basis. I eventually went to USC and studied film and got my master's. So I had that very traditional, classic storytelling education that I then took to movies and started learning how screenplays work and learning that. So I definitely have an undergirding from that novel writing origin.
well, so your first inclination being to be a novelist, having made a movie, or actually written and directed a movie, and then written a novel. As of right now, do you consider yourself more of a filmmaker or an author?
I'm both.
You're both? Okay.
I'm the triple threat. I'm the writer, I'm the director, I'm the author. No, I think that, I mean, I'm an artist, right? I mean, I think early on when I was younger, I pigeonholed myself. I was like, oh, I can't do that. I just have to write. I have to be, this is how this director got there. And everyone's journey is different, is what I learned along the way. And I think I just keep writing and creating because inevitably, too, people watch your movie and be like, okay, cool. Well, what's next? Or they'll read your book and they'll be like, well, what's next? You just have to always be trying to, yeah, I'm sure you're going to ask me at the end, what's next? What are you writing? What are you working on? Right. So, I
Yeah.
mean, you always have to be creating, you always have to be driving yourself forward. And I hope that this pluses my filmmaking too. Cause I mean, I've been working on the second movie, almost made it before the pandemic hit, and then that kind of got pushed and was working on something else, and then the strike hit. So the life gets in the way too. So my manager's out there pitching me right now, and hopefully I'll be back in that director's seat. But a lot of times when you go pitch things, people will say, "Oh well, I wish there was some IP to this, which is intellectual property. Like I wish this was based on a book," or which is why you see a lot of these things on Apple TV, right? Where it's this book or that book, or so they like to mine that because they think there's a built-in audience. So who knows what will happen with this book, but it definitely gives me IP and it gives me another feather in the cap and credit where outside of that realm and proves that you can tell the stories in different ways too. So it all kind of has synergy with each other.
Absolutely. Well, when writing a book, do you ever think about how it would translate? Obviously, before or after the fact, but as you're writing it, do you try to separate the two, or do you sometimes kind of like, well, if this was a film, you
Mm-hmm.
know,
Yeah, well, I mean, the reason I got into movies is my brain works very visually. So, like, I didn't realize it at the time, but I used to write these short stories, and I was really visualizing camera setup. I could see the spinning camera move and all these things that you take when you watch a movie, you expect to see. My brain naturally just kind of plans that way. So when I'm writing a novel, I can see the place, I can see the space, and I can think about how I would shoot it too. So it's just the way my brain works that it kind of is going both ways. And I think it helps too when you're writing a novel to imagine the space and how everyone is interacting with each other too. It gives like a grounding of reality to the story.
so when you're writing dialogue, let's say in the novel, like, do you ever think, Rains says, "Are you out of your mind?" Cut to Carla giving him a dirty look, something like that.
Well, I don't, you don't write your shot list in the script. At least good screenwriters don't. So the director will get mad at you if you do that. But certainly, I think too. Sometimes you write a one-liner, and you like you just said, you can imagine there's the reaction shot, or that's the button that gets you out of this chapter. And I think that helps my book too. Is like thinking about, movies are very like Boom, next scene. Boom. Like I said, what's the out, right? What's the line that gets you out? What's the moment? What's the explosion that you cut to this and it's a match? And that's a cool visual moment and that gets you in the next scene. So when you think like that for a book, I do think it pluses it because sometimes, some books they meander, right? And there can be some value in that. I don't really enjoy that. I want it to move. So I think it helped me kind of be like you said, there's the synergy and it's poppy and it clicks, and that's what I want.
Well, let's see here. Given your background in screenwriting, where structure, as we've just been talking about, is critical, do you find yourself naturally inclined to outline
Hmm.
your books as well, or are you more of a pantser? Or I hear a lot of people say, well, I've got this scaffolding outline and I kind of pants within that.
Right? Yeah. I mean, I definitely am more in the pantser category. I mean, I do outline. If you read it, you wouldn't be able to write a book off of it or a script, but it makes sense to me.
uh,
And I actually outline a lot of my mind too. I just can keep it all straight. It's the way my brain works as well. So it's a valuable thing to have. So when I start changing things, I know I'm like, oh, okay, like around page 80, there was something I need to fix. I can just keep all that straight.
oh, wow.
But I do think what you spoke to, I mean, screenplays are so structured, right? Like this has to happen on page 15. This has to happen on page 25. And then your midpoint needs to be at like 50-ish. And then you need to be spiraling into that third act around page 70, right? And you're going to end up with like 90 to 100 pages and you got an hour and a half to 2 hour movie. Each page is about a minute in a script, but you don't write 120 page scripts because no one will read them. But, so that structure, you have to learn it and then you can kind of break the rules within it too. But I mean, books have structure too. I don't think people realize it because they're longer. And I think people think you can just do whatever you want, but there is a structure. All stories have structure. They have an act structure. So having that screenplay grounding definitely helps with the book too.
Are there any specific storytelling techniques from screenwriting that you think it would help novelists to learn?
I think obviously when you have a screenplay, they're shorter, right? I mean, a screenplay is like 12,000 words, 15,000 words, maybe 20 at most. A short book, like a 300-page book, is 80,000 words. And, a Brandon Sanderson novel is probably 200,000 words. But us regular humans get about 80,000 words. And
Mere mortals.
us mere mortals, exactly. But, so you think about that right there is 4 to 5 times as long. And you're like, wow, I've got so much room. I can do whatever I want. But I think what screenwriters know is that there's power in brevity. You have to paint a picture quickly in a screenplay. You can't have 7 pages of description. So I would call on those powers when I was like, I think this is starting to lag, or like I spoke to earlier, someone read it, I was like, oh, I love it, but chapter 10, I'm just making it up, but chapter 10 was kind of slow, and I'm like, okay, well, it's probably too long. And then when you start trimming too, sometimes you'll be like, well, I could probably lose all this, and you slam two things together, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, that actually fits really well. And you find magic in that way too. And that, I think that's true of screenwriting and it's true of movie making too. When you start editing, you put things together that weren't meant to be together and they magically fit and it's better. Right. So I tried to take that to my book. When I would clean it up and edit, I would find sometimes some magic in what I hadn't intended.
Gotcha. Well, as far as your creative process is concerned, is there anything you avoid because you believe it stifles your creativity?
Avoid, I think just sitting down and doing is the struggle. And I'm sure a lot of people out there are writers and can relate to that. I mean, to me, it's always about getting words on page. I always say this. You gotta get words on page. And something I wish I'd known when I was younger is like, okay, you think about a book, it's like 80,000 words, right? And you're like, I'm gonna write 80,000 words. That sounds daunting. But if you just say, okay, every time I sit down at the computer, I'm going to try to write 500 words. And if you could do that 4 times a week, write 500 words, you got 2,000, you'd have a book in 40 weeks. So if you break it down into little accomplishable goals, everyone's got different time schedules, different work schedules. So you have to make something realistic for yourself. But that's how you get to the end. And you have to have words on page. I always say, get words on page, even if they're bad. you can go back and fix them later. And it's so much easier to edit and clean up stuff that you wrote that may not be great than to stare at a blank screen and wish it was a book, right? And that's just, I think, true of everything in life is accomplishable goals happen, but when you just say, I'm going to lose weight, you don't lose weight, right? But if you say, here's what I'm going to do that, it happens. And I think that's true of writing. And you have to just say, okay, I'm going to write this book. Here's my outline. Now I'm going to do it 3 times a week. I'm going to do it 6 times a week, whatever you can manage, 2 hours, 4 hours, and get those words on the page.
Well, kind of circling back to film, which director do you admire the most for their technical ability and which for their artistic vision? Like mine would be Kubrick and Villeneuve.
Mm-hmm. I'll go newer. I'm a big Christopher Nolan. I think his technical, what he accomplishes in every movie is spellbinding. It's really quite incredible. And obviously, he's like one of the only guys who gets to shoot on film and pulls it off, right? And gets those big IMAX film movies. And I think that's pretty impressive. And from a creative standpoint, I always admired Rian Johnson because I thought I could see myself in him, like his journey. He came out of USC. He made Brick, which was it's a noir detective story, right? That he did on a super low budget. And then each movie, he kind of did a stepstone of bigger movie, and eventually getting to Looper, which I thought was just awesome. And it's kind of this mid-tier sci-fi thriller. And like, if I could make that movie, I would be really happy, right? So obviously now he's gone on and he's doing Star Wars and he's doing all these big detective movies that are huge. But like in that early stage, I think I saw in him something that was mimicable and enviable in his work that I related to as well.
Gotcha. Well, I believe I have the name correct. The publisher of the book is Inkshares.
Inkshares.
Yeah. And I was looking at their description, and they describe themselves as a publisher whose genre is debut authors. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience with them?
Yeah, they were great. They kind of have this hybrid model where they have like almost a social network on their website where people are pitching ideas and talking to each other, and then they look for books that have a following. So, you're able to kind of get off the ground because you have a fan base, basically. So I thought that was a cool aspect to it. I knew someone whose friend had published through them, so I sat down with them and they had nothing but good things to say about it. So I decided to chase it and get after it, and they wanted to publish the book. So it ended up being a great synergy. And now, obviously, when you have a publisher behind you versus doing something more in that self-publish category, you get in front of a few more reviews and different types of things. Like, the book's been reviewed by Library Journal, Booklist, Kirkus, and I probably wouldn't have had those if it weren't for the publisher. So I think that's been a great synergy as well. And also, I really related to Noah, my editor. He gave notes and I said, oh, well, I'm really trying to go more in this direction. And then he jumped right on board and helped me try to make the book I wanted to make better, which I think doesn't always happen with people giving you notes of producers or editors. So I was really happy to have that experience with them as well.
Do a lot of editors get tyrannical?
Well, I think, I forget who it was. It might have been Stephen King. I read something where he said one of the biggest powers he ever had was as a young author was when he realized he could tell them no.
Oh,
nice. And I think that's a balance too, because sometimes, young authors will be like, well, I have a vision. Movie makers too. This is the movie I'm making. And people try to be like, I don't know. I think like XYZ. It's like, no, silence. You don't know what you're talking about. I am an auteur. And I think sometimes you have to, we all have, I always say you got to make the bad stuff too. And that's why you go to film school or writing school, or even if your film school is making bad movies on your cell phone with your friends, you got to let people watch them and tell you why they're bad too. So I think, to me, as a writer and as a filmmaker, your goal is to listen to people's notes and not necessarily take what they say the medicine is, right? They say, oh, I didn't like this. I think this character should do this, or they should have an eye patch. That would make them more relatable. And you're like, that's a terrible idea. But the note is valid that you're bored or this doesn't work for you. So how can I, as the author, make it better and fix it?
I see. Get the best of both worlds there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and sometimes you can go the other way too, where you just listen to people and then you end up with something that's not really you and it's not really good. And that'll happen too when I've had things where you had money behind it and they were giving you lots of notes. And you're like, well, I'm doing it because we're going to make this thing. And then it doesn't end up happening. And you look at the script, you're like, well, I can't even send this to anyone because it's not really very good because it's had 50 people's notes in it. And it's not really my thing anymore either. So there's a balance both ways.
Well, when you were making your movie, What Still Remains, I've interviewed screenwriters, and, a lot of them will say, I wrote this screenplay, this one particular screenplay, it got bought, and then the director just turned it into something unrecognizable. Well, you were obviously the director in this, so obviously that variable didn't come into play, but were you still beholden to somebody that wanted to kind of mess around with it?
I was fortunate. We raised the money for that movie and did it on the indie side, and they were very like, go make the thing you want to make. So there was power in that. And then I brought on my producers through USC, and then we basically punched above our weight class because we just went and got all the USC crew and their friends, and people worked below what they probably should make, and we were able to really do something above what our budget was. And I think that is where maybe the movie had to make some sacrifices, is that you just can't do even you say these budgets, you're like, oh, we had 700 grand or we had $1 million, and that's a lot of money, but it's nothing in a movie, right? And you start paying people to be there, even when you're paying them minimums, it adds up quick. And all of a sudden you only have 18 days to shoot 95 pages and you're shooting 8 pages a day. And there's just a reality of what is accomplishable. And like I said earlier, I think we ended up doing some cool creative stuff that made that movie better because of the limitations. If I'd had more money, we would, you always find ways to waste time and spend money. And that's like when you have less of them, you just find ways to not do it. But if my 18 days had become 25 days, I'm sure we wouldn't have had enough days to shoot, right? It's amazing how you find ways to fill the time.
Yeah. Let me bring this up. Are you able to see that?
Yes, it's me.
Look at that handsome guy. So I wanted to ask you about What Still Remains, as well as the production company you have. Was it down here?
Oh, yeah. So Strike the Sun Entertainment.
Yeah, Strike the Sun Entertainment.
Yeah, so I mean, that's my production company, and that's how we raise money for that movie. And, we've developed some other scripts, and we're trying to make some more stuff. And it's my labor of love.
And I'd love to play the trailer, but I'm sure there's some content ID that would hit me.
Yeah,
but,
go find that trailer. You can find it on joshmendoza.com, or if you just Google What Still Remains. It's you can still watch the movie on, I think, Apple TV. It's on Amazon. It's on Tubi. It did have a run on Netflix and Paramount Plus. We won't get into the weeds of streaming, but they license them for certain times and they go away. So it's still out there though, and still watchable.
All right. Sounds good. Well, I should have asked you this before we started recording, so this might be a no-go, but would you like to read a passage from the book?
I don't know if I have it in front of me, honestly.
Yeah, I should have asked before we started recording, but yeah,
If you want, I do have it here.
Oh, okay.
I can read the first page. Prologue. Did you have something in mind you want me to read? I can do chapter 1 too.
Well, I've been doing this thing where I put like a kind of a music backing to when people read. So, I don't know if there's something that you can think of that would be compelling to read with, some sort of emotional music.
Well, I'll do the beginning of chapter 1. How's that sound?
Sure.
All right. Chapter 1. My beater of a Ford Galaxy swerved across Wilshire as I fought to keep it between the white lines. I probably shouldn't have driven. It was late, after midnight, and I'd already had a few too many, though that had never stopped me before. The car groaned as I jerked the wheel back to center. Missed the sidewalk, but might have taken someone's mirror with me. Impossible to know for sure. Didn't feel too bad about it either way. People knew the risks parking in LA. At least I'd made incredible time. Threw the jalopy in the park just past Fairfax and stared at the neon sign for my favorite watering hole. The thing sputtered, missing a few letters, but clearly read The Lazy Giant. The street was deserted except for a few homeless catching a wink in the cold. This bar defined dive, and not in a hip way that made it a draw. That's why I liked it. And that's Duster Rains on his way to get that case he doesn't want. And that was actually the first image, and it stayed chapter one. Obviously, there's a prologue now, but that was the original image for the book I had, was him driving down the streets of LA, which I lived in for a long time, and shouldn't be out there. He's drunk and going to his favorite watering hole. That was like the first idea I had, and I've been very beholden to that and kept it in there no matter what.
Yeah. Definitely an iconic image in noir. Well, I know you're a busy man, so just one last question for you. What is the life of Josh Mendoza like outside of writing and filmmaking?
Well, I have two kids, 10 and 8, fourth and second grade, Abigail and Anderson, who are pumped they got mentioned in the dedication of the book too. So when you get the copy of the book, you'll see them. But they fill a lot of my time. So I got up at like 6:30 on Saturday to go to a soccer game, and I was like, I remember going to sports when it was like 10 a.m. I don't remember these 7:30 games, but maybe I've just blocked them from my memory. So, and my wife and I, we just took them to the Renaissance Fair this weekend, which was a blast. So, I mean, that's a lot of where I'm at in life, is parenthood, and I always wanted to be a dad, so it's exciting to get to kind of live that life with them and have the ability to do so, which is great.
Nice. Well, Josh, it has been a pleasure talking with you.
Vince, I really enjoyed it. I appreciate your time, and Plug and Shadow of the Eternal Watcher, which we just read. Here's the book.
Absolutely. Well, as we bring the show to a close, is there anything you would like to plug or reiterate to let your readers and viewers know about?
I don't know if anyone got it, but I wrote a book. It's called Shadow of the Eternal Watcher. That's what I'd love to plug.
I hear it's noir.
It's a noir science fiction book. But yeah, like I said, it's gotten some great reviews. I'm really excited. You write these things, at least I write them for people to read them or people to watch them. That's why I got into it. I want to reach an audience, and I want to have that communal experience with people. And like I said, it becomes like its own living thing. So I hope people go pick up the book. It's available wherever you get your books. If you have a favorite indie, they can order it for you. Just go in and ask them to, or it's on all the things, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the normal places. And it's got an audiobook too. Kellen Boyle narrated it. He did a great job. It's on Audible and wherever you like to get your audiobooks. So please go check it out. Shadow of the Eternal Watcher.
Sounds good. Well, if you would, please stick around after we stop recording. Just need to give you some quick information.
Awesome. I will, Vince.
And
I will not turn my computer off.
Please don't. But as far as our listeners at home, both live and on demand, all links will be in the description. And Josh, thank you again for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can watch the episodes live. Be sure to tune in every Tuesday for a new episode featuring the best and brightest writers and filmmakers of dark literature and film. So until then, stay healthy, stay sane, and as always, thank you for listening. See you next time.